Left to die on her own, the little native girl wept until the most feared gunslinger fed her. A desolate wind, sharp and unforgiving, clawed its way across the parched plains, a relentless predator with no prey but the spirit of anything left breathing. It carried the scent of dust and distant sage, a grim lullaby for a land that knew only hardship. Amidst this vast, indifferent canvas of ochre earth and an impossibly wide, bruised sky, a man rode. He was a silhouette against the dying light, a figure etched from shadow and rumor, known only as Silas Blackwood. His name was a whisper in saloons, a curse in courtrooms, and a cold dread in the hearts of those who had crossed him. They called him Shadow, not merely for his preferred attire or the dark legend he cast, but for the way he seemed to materialize from nothingness, leaving only echoes of despair in his wake. His face, often obscured beneath the brim of his hat, was a map of harsh lines and deeper scars, each crease a testament to battles fought and lost, to choices made and regretted. Yet beneath the hardened mask, a quiet storm brewed, a maelstrom of unspoken grief and gnawing emptiness that no amount of whiskey or gunsmoke could ever truly quell. His horse, a sturdy bay mare, picked its way through the deepening twilight, hooves thudding a rhythmic, somber beat against the packed earth. The air grew colder, holding the promise of a moonless night, the kind that swallowed hope whole. It was in this encroaching gloom, as the first stars pricked the indigo canvas above, that a sound, thin and fragile, reached him. It was not the howl of a coyote, nor the moan of the wind through skeletal trees. This was something else, something profoundly human, yet stripped bare of all the usual defenses. It was the sound of weeping, a quiet, desperate sorrow that seemed to leach the last vestiges of warmth from the air. Silas, a man whose life had long been a monument to indifference, felt an unexpected jolt, a discordant note in the symphony of his practiced stoicism. He reined in the mare, his hand, accustomed to the cold weight of a revolver, hovering uncertainly. The sound led him to a cluster of weathered rocks, mere hunks of granite thrown carelessly across the landscape. There, huddled against the unyielding stone, a small form stirred, a child, barely more than a bundle of rags and raw grief. Her head was bowed, slender shoulders shaking with each silent sob, her small frame convulsing with a pain too vast for her years. She was Lakota by the look of her, her dark braids tangled, her deerskin dress torn. The sight was a stark, brutal tableau. A child, alone and abandoned, weeping for a world that had seemingly forgotten her. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments where you're watching from and subscribe if you want more content like this one. Silas dismounted slowly, his every movement measured, cautious. He was a predator, yes, but not of this kind. The air around the girl shimmered with a profound, almost palpable sorrow, a thick, invisible shroud that seemed to suffocate the very last breaths of the twilight. He watched her for a long moment, a man accustomed to assessing threats now confronted with something utterly defenseless. His hand instinctively went to the canteen at his hip, then to the worn satchel slung across his saddle, where a few rations of dried jerky lay. It was a strange impulse, an unbidden flicker of something akin to pity in a heart long calcified by violence and solitude. He knelt, his spurs jingling softly, a sound that in other contexts heralded doom, but here was merely a metallic whisper against the vast silence. The girl flinched, a tiny terrified tremor running through her small body, but she did not look up. Her silence was a deeper cut than any scream, a testament to a trauma that had stolen her voice, leaving only the eloquence of tears. He offered the water, holding the canteen out. His fingers, calloused and scarred, were surprisingly gentle as they rested near her small, trembling hand. She hesitated, then slowly, almost imperceptibly, reached out. Her fingers brushed against his, a contact fleeting yet profound, an unexpected bridge between two disparate worlds. He watched as she drank, long, desperate gulps that spoke of thirst. Yes, but also a deeper hunger for succor. Then, he offered the jerky. Her eyes, dark and wide, finally lifted, meeting his. They were pools of profound sorrow, but within them, a flicker of something ancient and resilient, a strength that defied her fragile form. Her gaze, devoid of accusation yet brimming with an unfathomable depth of pain, pierced through Silas's carefully constructed walls, touching a nerve he thought long dead. It was a gaze that spoke of starvation, not just of the body, but of the soul, a desperate yearning for kindness in a world that had only shown her cruelty. He watched her devour the jerky, small, fierce bites, each chew a testament to the primal instinct for survival. A ghost of a memory, fleeting and unwelcome, pricked at the edges of his consciousness. A small hand, another time, reaching for his own, long before the shadows had claimed him entirely. He pushed it down deep into the recesses of his mind, a place where such vulnerabilities were sealed away. Yet the image persisted, a persistent ache in the hollow of his chest. He was no savior, he told himself, no knight in tarnished armor. He was Silas Blackwood, a man forged in the crucible of bloodshed, stained by 1,000 unspoken sins. To offer kindness was to invite weakness, a fatal flaw in a world that devoured the soft. The night deepened around them, a velvet cloak embroidered with the cruel glitter of 1,000,000 distant stars. The wind, which had seemed to howl with grief, now whispered of desolate possibilities. He had to consider his next move. Leave her? The thought was a bitter gall in his throat, a betrayal of an impulse he barely understood. Take her with him? That was madness. His path was a solitary one, fraught with danger, leading always towards the next confrontation, the next dark horizon. She was a burden, a vulnerability he could ill afford. Yet, as he watched her, curled into a small shivering ball, a spark ignited within him, a flicker of defiance against the crushing weight of his own reputation. He couldn't leave her. The words, unbidden, formed in the silent chambers of his mind, a rare concession to an unexpected, inconvenient empathy. The plains around them stretched into an infinite blackness, a stark reminder of their isolation. Yet in that shared vulnerability, a fragile, unspoken connection began to tentatively form. The girl, whose name he would later learn was Anya, spoke no English. Her words, when she dared to utter them, were soft guttural sounds, a language of clicks and whispers that spoke of the land, of ancient spirits, and of a sorrow too deep for translation. Silas, a man of few words himself, found communication in gestures, in the shared silence, and in the unspoken understanding that passed between them. He observed her closely, searching for clues in her torn clothing, the faint bruises on her slender arms, the way her eyes darted nervously at every distant sound. There were no immediate signs of a struggle near where he found her, no scattered belongings, no overturned wagon wheels. It was as if she had simply been left, a discarded doll in the vast, unforgiving expanse. Yet the absence of chaos was in itself a kind of chilling chaos. Someone had brought her here. Someone had abandoned her. The realization settled heavy in his gut, a cold, hard knot of anger. It wasn't the rage of a lawman, or even a righteous man. It was the quiet, simmering fury of a man who understood abandonment, who knew the bitter taste of being left to fend for oneself against an indifferent world. As dawn painted the eastern sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange, revealing the harsh lines of the landscape, Silas saw the faint, almost imperceptible tracks leading away from where Anya had been found. Not wagon tracks, not a horse, but the clear impression of a boot, large and deliberate. It was a man's boot, one set. It faded quickly, swallowed by the wind-scoured earth, leaving only the unsettling echo of a single cold departure. He packed what little he had, Anya watching him with wide, wary eyes, a silent question in their depths. He didn't know what he was getting into, but the path was clear. He had to find out who had done this, and why. It wasn't about justice, not for him. Justice was a word whispered by fools and written by hypocrites. It was about something far more primal, a simmering resentment for cruelty, an unspoken pact with the vulnerable that he hadn't known he possessed. He lifted her onto the mare's saddle, his large hands careful around her small waist. Her body felt impossibly light, frail. As they rode, the sun climbing higher, casting long, sharp shadows, Silas's mind drifted. A long-buried memory surfaced, unbidden. The faint scent of lavender, the warmth of a small hand nestled in his own, the innocent, trusting laughter of a child. It was a phantom limb of a life he had once glimpsed, a life before the iron had entered his soul, before the dust had become his constant companion. He shook his head, a grim internal battle waged and lost. This girl, Anya, was tethered to a past he had painstakingly buried, a dangerous spark in the dry tinder of his existence. He had to find her people, find her family. It was the only way to sever this fragile, yet potent connection. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with unseen dangers, but for the first time in years, Silas Blackwood felt a strange, unsettling sense of purpose, a magnetic pull towards a reckoning that was not his own. The town of redemption, if one could even dignify such a collection of sun-bleached shacks and dust-choked saloons, with a name so grand, shimmered like a mirage in the midday heat. Its very name was an irony, a cruel joke etched into the faded sign above the general store, for there was little redemption to be found within its crooked streets. A pall of suspicion hung in the air, thick as the dust that coated every surface, a palpable tension that seemed to vibrate beneath the soles of Silas's boots. As he rode in, Anya clutched to his side, her small face buried against his chest. The handful of townsfolk who had been loitering in the oppressive heat straightened, their eyes narrowing. The whisper of his name, Silas Blackwood, seemed to travel on the hot wind, carrying the weight of all his dark deeds, all the lives he had taken, all the legends that painted him as a specter of vengeance. Farmers with weathered faces and calloused hands paused in their chores, their gazes hardening. Women, their dresses faded and their expressions weary, pulled their children closer, their eyes holding a mixture of fear and thinly veiled contempt. They saw the shadow, the killer, the embodiment of everything they feared in the untamed West, and beside him, the small, brown-skinned girl, an unwelcome anomaly, a symbol of a people they considered alien, savage, and to be feared. The hostility was a tangible force, a wall of suspicion that pressed in on them from all sides. Silas dismounted in front of the saloon, its doors perpetually ajar, exhaling the stale scent of cheap whiskey and desperation. He ignored the stares, the murmured curses, the quick, frightened whispers. His focus was solely on Anya. She was trembling, a small, fragile bird caught in a storm. He guided her inside, the sudden shift from the searing sun to the cool, dark interior, a jarring transition. The few men nursing drinks at the bar froze, their hands hovering over their glasses, their eyes fixed on him. A silence, heavy and suffocating, descended, broken only by the creak of the floorboards under his boots. The barkeeper, a fleshy man with a greasy apron and eyes like chipped flint, slowly wiped down the counter, his gaze flicking between Silas and the girl. "What can I do for you, Blackwood?" he drawled, his voice laced with a tremor of fear he tried and failed to conceal. Silas's reply was terse, blunt. "Water, and a room, for the girl." The barkeeper scoffed, a sneer twisting his lips. "We don't cater to her kind, Blackwood, and as for you, your kind ain't welcome much either." The words hung in the air, dripping with prejudice and overt challenge. Silas's hand, resting on the butt of his pistol, tightened almost imperceptibly. The air grew suddenly colder, taut with unspoken threat. He met the barkeeper's gaze, his eyes like chips of glacial ice conveying a silent, unyielding warning. The barkeeper swallowed hard, his bravado wilting under the gunslinger's intense scrutiny. The price of defying Silas Blackwood was well known, written in blood across countless towns. He would get his water, he would get his room. But the underlying message was clear. Redemption offered no comfort, no welcome, to either of them. Their presence here was an affront, an open wound in the town's prejudiced heart. The small, dusty room in the back of the saloon was a temporary reprieve from the hostile gazes, but the tension lingered, a palpable presence within the cramped space. Silas sat on the edge of a creaking cot watching Anya, who huddled on the floor, her back against the wall, her eyes wide and wary. The silence between them was not empty, but filled with the unspoken weight of their shared vulnerability, the invisible threads of their nascent connection. He offered her a meager meal he'd managed to procure, a tough piece of bread and some dried beans. She ate slowly, meticulously, her small movements conveying a profound gratitude that tightened something knotty in his chest. As she ate, Her gaze fell upon a tarnished silver locket that hung from a rawhide string around her neck, hidden beneath her dress. It was a simple piece, crudely fashioned, but within its worn surface he could faintly discern the etching of a bird, wings spread in flight. It was a sparrow. She traced the outline with a feather-light touch, and for the first time since he found her, a flicker of something beyond sorrow touched her eyes. A fragile memory, perhaps, or a distant hope. He gestured to the locket. "Your family?" he asked, his voice rough, unused to such inquiries. She nodded, her eyes welling up, but no tears fell. It was a silent, stoic grief, harder to witness than any outburst. She then spoke, a single word, hushed and trembling. "Mama." It was a universal sound, a whisper of loss that transcended language barriers. A memory, sharper this time, sliced through Silas's guarded mind. Not a child, but a woman. Her hair the color of midnight, her eyes as deep and warm as a summer night sky. Her name had been Alara, and her laughter, once so vibrant, had been extinguished in a moment of unimaginable cruelty, a dark chapter in his past that had shaped the monster he had become. He had failed her. The thought was a raw wound, perpetually unhealed. He saw Alara's eyes in Anya's, a mirror reflecting a tragedy he was powerless to prevent, a loss that had left him hollow. It was then, in that quiet, dust-filled room, that a different kind of understanding began to form. He wasn't just protecting Anya from the external dangers. He was fighting a shadow of his own past, battling the ghosts of his failures, seeking a fragile, impossible redemption through this small, lost girl. The locket, a silent symbol, now represented more than just Anya's lost mother. It was a link to his own buried history, a haunting reminder of the life he had once loved and tragically lost. He had to know who did this to Anya. He had to, if only to silence the relentless echoes of his own past mistakes. The threat wasn't just lurking outside their door. It was within, waiting to consume him. The fragile peace of their dusty room was shattered by a sudden, violent banging on the door, reverberating through the thin walls like a drumbeat of doom. Silas's hand went instinctively to his revolver, his gaze hardening, all traces of his earlier reflection vanishing under a mask of steely resolve. The voice that followed was loud, arrogant, and laced with the casual cruelty of men accustomed to wielding power without consequence. "Open up, Blackwood. We know you're in there, and we know you got the squaw with you." It was Sheriff Thorne, a man whose badge was merely a license for corruption, his jowly face a monument to self-indulgence, and his eyes as cold and calculating as a rattlesnake's. He had seen Thorne earlier, lurking near the general store, his gaze lingering too long on Anya. Now he understood the true nature of the threat. It wasn't just general prejudice, it was specific, targeted malevolence. Thorne and his deputies, two hulking brutes with grim, vacant expressions, were the embodiment of the societal bias Anya faced, the enforcers of an unjust order. Silas knew Thorne. Their paths had crossed before, in a different town, under different circumstances, always ending in bloodshed. Thorne was one of the many reasons Silas kept moving, a festering wound in the underbelly of the West, preying on the weak, turning a blind eye to the atrocities committed by those with money or influence. Anya flinched, pressing herself further into the corner, her small body trembling. The fear in her eyes was raw, primal. Silas's resolve solidified. He wasn't leaving her. Not now. Not ever. Not after Alara. He moved silently, positioning himself behind the door, the heavy Colt 45 feeling like an extension of his own hand. "What do you want, Thorne?" he barked, his voice low and dangerous, a predator's growl. "Just the girl, Blackwood," Thorne sneered through the flimsy door. "She's a witness, see, to a little, unfortunate incident out on the trail, and we'd rather she kept quiet about it. Easier that way." The unspoken words hung heavy in the air. Easier to make her disappear, easier to silence her, easier to bury the truth. The incident on the trail, it had to be her family, her mother. This wasn't merely about land or resources. It was about covering up a heinous crime. The revelation hit Silas like a physical blow. They hadn't just abandoned her. They had tried to eliminate all evidence, all witnesses. And Anya, by some miracle, had survived. The full extent of the villainy they faced became horrifyingly clear. Thorne and his men weren't just prejudiced townsfolk. They were murderers, complicit in the deaths of Anya's family. The tension in the small room was a live wire, humming with electricity, poised to snap. Silas knew, with an icy certainty, that there would be no peaceful resolution. The gunslinger, the man who had always walked alone, now found himself irrevocably bound to a small, silent girl, dragged into a conflict that was not his, yet somehow, intimately, his own. The faint scent of gunpowder already seemed to fill the air, a premonition of the violence to come. The flimsy door splintered inward with a resounding crack, splintering into jagged shards, and the deputies, burly and brutish, charged into the cramped room, their faces contorted with ill intent. Thorne, a smirk playing on his lips, lingered in the doorway, content to let his hounds do the dirty work. But Silas Blackwood was no easy prey. He moved like a shadow himself, a blur of motion in the dimly lit space. The colt barked, a guttural roar that filled the small room, deafening in its confined echo. One deputy stumbled back, a crimson blossom spreading across his chest, his eyes wide with a surprise that quickly faded into the blankness of death. The other, momentarily stunned, fumbled for his sidearm. Silas didn't give him the chance. He closed the distance in a single fluid stride, his fist connecting with the deputy's jaw with a sickening thud. The man collapsed, a dead weight, his body hitting the floor with a muffled thump. Thorne's smirk vanished, replaced by a snarl of fury. He drew his own weapon, but Silas was faster. The revolver was already aimed, steady as a rock, the black maw of the barrel fixed squarely on Thorne's chest. "You lay one hand on that girl, Thorne, and I'll put you in the ground right beside your men." Silas's voice was a low growl, devoid of emotion, yet radiating a primal, dangerous intensity. Thorne, recognizing the cold certainty in Silas's eyes, slowly raised his hands, his face a mask of thwarted rage. "You're a fool, Blackwood. This ain't your fight. There's more where they came from," he spat, gesturing vaguely towards the town. Silas knew this was true. Thorne was merely a pawn in a larger game, an ugly extension of the systemic corruption that plagued the land. But he also knew that for Anya, this was her fight, and by extension, his. He would not leave her. He would not fail again. Anya, who had cowered behind him during the brief, brutal exchange, now peered out, her eyes wide but surprisingly not filled with terror. There was a dawning comprehension, a quiet understanding of the violence that had just unfolded on her behalf. Silas grabbed Thorne's arm, twisting it behind his back with a practiced, brutal efficiency that elicited a grunt of pain from the sheriff. "Get on your feet. You're going to help us get out of here." He used Thorne as a human shield, pushing him out of the saloon, past the startled patrons and into the dusty street. The few townsfolk who had dared to venture out froze, their eyes widening in shock and fear at the sight of the notorious gunslinger, his face grim, an unconscious deputy at his feet, and a trembling sheriff being forced to lead his retreat. This wasn't a heroic stand. It was a desperate flight, a grim reckoning with the consequences of his choices. As they mounted the mare, Thorne forced to ride ahead at gunpoint, Silas felt the small, fragile weight of Anya behind him. She was silent, but her small hand found his, a delicate touch that grounded him amidst the chaos. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was far from over. Redemption had merely shown its teeth, and the rest of the pack would soon follow. They rode through the night, a desperate, silent flight from the encroaching shadows of redemption. Thorne, his face pale and his defiance crumbling under the constant pressure of Silas's pistol pressed against his spine, led them on a circuitous route, avoiding the main trails. The mare, tireless and strong, carried the three of them through gullies and over rocky outcrops, the only sound the rhythmic thud of hooves and the anxious snorting of the horse. Anya, nestled against Silas's back, her small hand still clutching his, had finally fallen into a fitful sleep, exhausted by the day's terror. Silas, however, rode with eyes wide open, constantly scanning the moonlit landscape, his senses heightened, every shadow a potential threat, every distant sound a warning. He knew Thorne would lead them astray if given the chance, or betray them at the first opportunity. The sheriff was a coward, but a cunning one. They stopped only once, briefly, at a remote watering hole, hidden deep within a narrow canyon. The air here was cool, still, carrying the scent of damp earth and unseen desert blooms. As Silas dismounted, Thorn attempted a desperate lunge trying to grab Silas's gun. But Silas was faster, his reflexes honed by years of surviving the unforgiving wild. A swift, brutal strike to the temple rendered Thorn unconscious, collapsing him into a heap of dirt and self-pity. Silas hogtied him, leaving him where he lay, a silent promise of future consequences hanging heavy in the desert air. He replenished their water, his gaze lingering on Anya's sleeping face. She was so small, so utterly vulnerable, yet she had endured so much. A profound sense of responsibility, heavy yet strangely comforting, settled over him. This wasn't about the law, or revenge, or even justice in the conventional sense. It was about protecting this one fragile spark of innocence in a world intent on crushing it. It was about standing between her and the encroaching darkness, a darkness he knew intimately, a darkness that had almost consumed him too. As they resumed their journey, the first faint light of dawn painting the eastern horizon, Silas found himself reflecting on the path that had led him to this point. He was a gunslinger, a man of violence, a pariah. Yet here he was, riding through the desolate wilderness. A small Native American girl nestled against his back, fleeing corrupt lawmen who sought to silence her. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. He had spent years running from his past, from the ghosts that haunted him, from the memory of Alara. But in Anya he saw a chance, however slim, to confront those ghosts, not by running, but by standing firm. He had left Alara vulnerable, and she had paid the ultimate price. He would not make that mistake again. Anya's quiet presence, her unwavering trust, was a strange kind of burden. Yes, but also a profound gift, forcing him to confront the moral ambiguity that had defined his life. He was no hero. He never would be. But perhaps, just perhaps, he could be something less terrible, something akin to a guardian, a silent sentinel against the world's relentless cruelty. The sun rose, painting the landscape in a stark, unforgiving light, revealing every jagged rock, every thorny bush, every winding path ahead. The journey was far from over. They found refuge in a secluded alcove, a hidden natural fortress carved into the side of a towering mesa, its entrance obscured by dense scrub and ancient, gnarled mesquite trees. The air here was still, infused with the scent of sun-baked earth and the faint, sweet perfume of unseen wildflowers. It was a place of quiet contemplation, a temporary sanctuary from the relentless pursuit he knew would come. Silas meticulously checked his weapons, cleaning his Colt, sharpening his hunting knife, his movements precise, almost ritualistic. Every click of the hammer, every whisper of steel against leather, spoke of an impending confrontation. He had known, with the certainty of a man who lived on the knife's edge, that Thorn wouldn't be their only pursuer. Men like Thorn, men who operated in the shadows of corrupt power, rarely worked alone. There would be others, perhaps bounty hunters drawn by the scent of a notorious gunslinger, or more of Thorn's hired muscle, men devoid of conscience, driven only by the promise of coin. Anya watched him, her dark eyes reflecting the quiet intensity of his preparations. She picked up a smooth, flat stone, tracing patterns in the dust, her small hand moving with a meditative rhythm. After a long silence, she pointed to the locket around her neck, then to herself, and then, slowly, she spoke a string of words in her native tongue, her voice soft but clear. Silas didn't understand the words, but he understood the gesture, the profound weight of her grief. He sat beside her, his large frame dwarfing her small one. She then, with infinite care, opened the locket. Inside, worn and faded, were two tiny, intricately braided strands of hair, one dark like her own, the other lighter, almost auburn. She touched the darker one, her lips forming the silent word, "Mama." Then she touched the lighter one, and this time a new word thick with sorrow emerged. "Papa." It was the first time she had spoken of her father, a silent figure in her tragedy. The raw, unvarnished truth of her loss settled between them, a tangible weight. She looked up at Silas, her eyes brimming, but again no tears fell. Her stoicism was a testament to the immense burden she carried. They killed them," she whispered in broken English, a few precious words she must have learned. "Bad men, with badges. The final 3 words were a hammer blow, confirming Silas's darkest suspicions. Thorn and his crew weren't just covering up a minor incident. They were responsible for the cold-blooded murder of Anya's parents. The realization sparked a cold, righteous fury in Silas, a slow burn that promised a devastating blaze. His hands clenched into fists, the knuckles white. He had seen too much injustice, too much unchecked cruelty in his life. But this was different. This wasn't just the casual brutality of the frontier. It was a targeted, malevolent act against an innocent family, perpetrated by the very people sworn to protect them. The silence in the alcove deepened, thick with unspoken resolve. Silas looked at Anya, her small face etched with a wisdom beyond her years, and knew what he had to do. The confrontation wasn't just coming. He was going to meet it head-on. He would be her shield, her silent avenger. The ghosts of his past, the memory of Ilara's lost laughter demanded it. The sparrow on the locket, a symbol of freedom and fragility, now seemed to beat its silent wings in anticipation of the storm. The sun beat down on the mesa, a relentless, unforgiving eye. Silas had chosen his ground well, a narrow pass flanked by sheer rock faces, a choke point where numbers meant little against a single determined man. He had seen the dust cloud first, a faint smudge on the horizon, growing steadily larger, signaling the inevitable. They were coming, a dozen riders, perhaps more, led by Thorn, his face a mask of furious retribution, eager to reclaim his captive and exact his revenge. Anya was hidden deep within the alcove, instructed to remain silent no matter what. Silas knew this was the pivotal moment, the crucible that would test not only his skill with a gun but the very core of his fractured being. He was no stranger to violence. His life had been a symphony of it. But this time, it was different. This wasn't about self-preservation or personal vengeance or the cold calculation of a hired gun. This was about something purer, something he hadn't tasted in years. Protection. The first shots rang out, sharp cracks that echoed off the canyon walls, followed by the thud of hooves and the guttural shouts of men thirsty for blood. Silas moved with the grim efficiency of a coiled snake, his Colt spitting fire and death. He targeted the riders, the men who had dared to raise a hand against the innocent, the men who had left a child to die. The battle was a brutal, chaotic dance of lead and dust, a grim ballet performed under the unforgiving gaze of the desert sun. One by one, the riders fell, their shouts turning to choked gasps, their bodies collapsing from their saddles. Silas took a bullet, a searing pain in his shoulder, but he barely registered it. His focus was absolute, his will unbreakable. He was a force of nature, a harbinger of reckoning, fueled by a rage long dormant, now unleashed with devastating precision. Thorn, riding at the front, his face contorted with malice, fired wildly, his shot straying wide. He was no match for Silas's cold precision. A shot found Thorn's leg, sending him sprawling from his horse, screaming in pain and fear. The remaining deputies, seeing their leader fall, their numbers dwindling, hesitated, their bravado evaporating in the face of Silas's relentless onslaught. They were men of power, yes, but only when they held the advantage. Stripped of their numbers, their cruelty exposed, they were cowards. Silas advanced slowly, his steps deliberate, the Colt still aimed, a silent promise of finality. He had them cornered, broken. Irony, sharp and bitter, seeped into the air. The feared gunslinger, a man of death fighting for life, the men of law bringing only lawlessness. From her hiding place, Anya watched, her eyes wide, silent witness to the brutal dance of survival. She saw the rage, the pain, the merciless efficiency of the man who had fed her, who had chosen to be her shield. It was a terrifying spectacle, yet within it, she recognized a profound, terrifying devotion. This was the cost of her survival, the grim price of his unexpected mercy. The dust settled, revealing a landscape scarred by conflict, littered with fallen men and the lingering scent of gunpowder. The final confrontation had been brutal, decisive. But Silas knew, as the silence of the desert once again claimed the mesa, that the battle was won. But the war for her future had just begun. The silence that followed the gunfire was not peace, but the heavy ringing silence of aftermath, thick with the scent of gunpowder and the metallic tang of blood. Silas stood amidst the fallen, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his shoulder throbbing with a dull, persistent ache. Thorn lay groaning, his leg bleeding freely, his earlier arrogance replaced by a whimpering terror. The remaining deputies, 2 of them, sat huddled together, their faces pale, their weapons discarded, their spirits broken. They were no longer a threat, merely pathetic figures stripped of their power. Silas's gaze, cold and unwavering, swept over them, then landed on Thorn. He had a choice: end it here, silence the architect of Anya's tragedy forever. The thought was tempting, a visceral pull towards a brutal final justice that the world had denied him for so long. But Anya was here, and she had seen enough. The cycle of violence had to break, if only for her sake. He walked to Thorn, pulling a discarded rope from one of the fallen deputies, and without a word he bound the man's hands and feet, leaving him vulnerable, exposed to the harsh elements, a prisoner of the very land he had desecrated. The other 2 deputies were similarly disarmed and bound, left to face whatever fate awaited them once the sun climbed higher and their absence was noted. He then walked towards the alcove, his movements slow, deliberate, each step a testament to the pain blooming in his shoulder. Anya emerged, her small form hesitant, her eyes still wide, taking in the grim scene. She didn't cry, didn't scream. Her silence was a profound, adult understanding of the brutal world she inhabited. She looked at the bound men, then at Silas, her gaze lingering on the dark stain spreading across his shirt. Without a word, she reached for a piece of cloth from her small pouch, a strip of deerskin soft and clean, and carefully, tentatively, began to press it against his wound. Her touch was feather-light, filled with a quiet, compassionate intensity that startled him. He, a man accustomed to tending his own wounds in grim solitude, felt an unfamiliar warmth spread through him, deeper than the sting of the bullet. It was a profound, unspoken gesture of care, a simple act that spoke volumes of her resilient spirit and growing trust. "You'll be all right," she whispered, her English still broken, but infused with an earnest conviction. He looked at her, truly looked at her, seeing not just a lost child, but a survivor, a testament to the enduring human spirit. The battle was over, yes, but the purpose remained. He had protected her, kept her safe, and in doing so, he had perhaps begun to mend a small, fractured piece of himself. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of fiery orange and soft violet, a stark contrast to the grim reality of the canyon floor. Silas and Anya sat in silence, sharing a meager meal of dried meat and stale bread. The initial shock of the battle had begun to recede, replaced by a quiet exhaustion. Anya, no longer trembling, leaned against Silas, her small body a warm, trusting weight against his side. The locket around her neck, her only tangible link to her past, glinted faintly in the fading light. He knew he couldn't keep her, not permanently. His life was a constant flight, a dance with danger that no child should ever be forced to learn. But neither could he leave her, not truly. He had tasted the bitter gall of failure, seen the tragic consequences of abandonment once too often. The memory of Alara, a phantom limb that ached with every beat of his heart, reminded him of the solemn oath he had unknowingly taken. Anya, for all her fragility, carried within her the promise of a future, a flicker of hope that the world, despite its relentless cruelty, could still yield moments of unexpected grace. He looked out across the vast rolling plains, stretching endlessly towards a distant, hazy horizon. He had no definitive answers, no clear destination, only a quiet, unwavering resolve. He would take her to the nearest mission, to a community that would offer her safety, education, and the opportunity to heal, to build a life free from the shadows that clung to his own. It wouldn't be easy. The road ahead was still fraught with peril, with men who sought to exploit, to harm, to simply forget. But he would see her there. He would ensure her path diverged from his own, leading towards light, not lingering darkness. Anya stirred, looking up at him. Her eyes, still holding the echoes of past sorrow, now also held a dawning understanding, a profound sense of gratitude that transcended words. She knew, with the innocent wisdom of a child, that her protector, this fearsome man of shadows, was offering her a future, a chance at a life she might not otherwise have had. He was not a hero, not in the traditional sense. His hands were stained, his soul scarred. But in this moment, in this desolate landscape, he was everything she needed. Their journey together, born of tragedy and unexpected kindness, was nearing its end, not with a flourish, but with a quiet, grounded hope. The open loop of their story would continue, each forging a new path, forever linked by the brief yet profound intersection of their lives. For Silas, the weight of his past would always remain, but now it carried a new dimension, the silent promise of a future, a fragile, hopeful dawn breaking over the endless plains.